Okay. So I'm Nicky Wheeler-Nicholson. My grandfather, Major Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson, basically started the comic book industry, and a lot of people don't really know that much about him. I started researching his life, I guess about 20 years ago, and it's a pretty big life. You can just go through. So what a lot of people think of when they think of DC Comics is naturally Superman. This is from the 1939 comic book that came out for the World's Fair. But there's a lot before Superman. And Siegel and Shuster were there working for my grandfather before Superman. So this is the first comic that he came out with called New Fun. And it was tabloid size. And probably you guys all know this stuff up one side and down the other. And on the cover was a comic called Jack Woods. And what a lot of the comic history guys didn't know is that that was originally a pulp story of my grandfather's from a pulp called The Aristocrat that was originally published in Adventure magazine, the pulp magazine. So the first comic magazines had comics on the front, and it started out with there were 4. And then it went down to 6, and then down to 2, and then finally we get the comic book cover. And this all took place during the period that my grandfather was publishing comics. So he organized this company, National Allied Publications, Inc., in 1934. And they came out with the that first comic in January. It was on the newsstand a little before January 1935. This is an ad for the next comic magazine that he came out with. So the first one was called New Fun, and then it was called More Fun. And then this is the second magazine he came out with, and it was called New Comics. And it eventually changed to, in little type, in between New and Comics, there was Adventure. So New Adventure Comics. And then gradually, the New went away, and it just became Adventure Comics. Can you go back to that one, Andrew? This one, most of you probably know, was the cover was done by Vin Sullivan, who was really important in the whole Superman myth. And this one was this December 1936? Yeah. Okay. So that one, the one before, was December 1935. This is December 1936. And this cover was done by Whitney Ellsworth, who is also recognizable, I think, to all of you. And so by now, we've got no more, comics on the cover. We have these on the cover, okay? I love these. These are so recognizable to everybody who loves comics history because they're Craig Fliesel. And one of the things that I think is so amazing about Craig is I think he's such an innovator because, to me, he took the sort of concept of the pulp covers and then, made it into a cartoon. And I think that's what's very innovative about Craig. Detective Comics came out in, this is December 1937. Detective Comics, my grandfather started the comics with National Allied, and he had Fun Comics and New Comics, Adventure Comics. He owned those, but when he came up with Detective Comics, he went into business with Harry Donenfeld and Jack Reeves. So that happened in 1937. So he and Jack Leibowitz were the co-owners of Detective Comics. And I guess some of you probably know about what happened, that he was forced into bankruptcy in 1938. And what the bankruptcy was about National Allied, which became Nicholson Publishing, Inc. It was not Detective Comics. So he was still co-owner of Detective Comics when Donenfeld and Leibowitz took him into bankruptcy. Siegel and Shuster started working for my grandfather right away. A lot of people haven't seen some of these early comics of theirs. And I have to tell you, I really love these. This is Dr. Occult, and of course everybody sees the cape here and the blue trunks. And I really think that a lot of Joe Shuster's art in these early comics is just, I think it's some of his best work. And my guess is that partially that has to do with the fact that he was not under so much pressure, because he was under a lot of pressure once they really started with Superman, and his eyesight was still. My grandfather, a lot of people don't know this, but he came up with the ideas for some of the cartoons, the comics that Siegel and Shuster drew. So Federal Men was my grandfather's idea. And you can, again, I just love this artwork. I think it's so beautiful. Later, you know, if you want to look in the book, you can see it a lot better. And then what's interesting to me about Federal Men is, go to that next one, is, I don't know if you can tell, but this Federal Men takes place in space. So, you know, already you can start to see these ideas of Superman beginning to gel in these early comics. And the other, one of the other comics that my grandfather came up with was called Slam Bradley. That was his character as well. And when you see the images of Slam that Joe Shuster drew, there's the Superman curl, the dark hair. You know, it's just really obvious that they were starting to work out this whole concept. So, how did this guy end up doing comics? I'm not really sure. He was always a very creative person, and he had this interesting military aspect. So his grandfather was in the Union Army, and my grandmother really looked up to him. And my great-grandmother was a huge influence on my grandfather, and she really looked up to her father. So there was something about the military, you know, pushing him to go in that direction, and the whole idea of the soldier and honor. And he was also a big fan of Sir Walter Scott. So there was this whole idea of knights and, you know, that kind of thing. So he went to St. John's Manlius and graduated in 1911. And this is an early photo of him. He went into the Army as a second lieutenant in 1912, and he was on the Mexican border chasing bandits, Pancho Villa, that kind of thing, and he was under Blackjack Pershing. And that whole period, that military period, informed the next chapter of his life. He always wrote. His mother was a writer. At the turn of the century, she was a suffragette when most women were outside of the home. She was a writer, and so that was part of his world from the very beginning. So he started writing for pulps, but earliest I've found is 1924. So he started writing for the Pulps in 1924, and he continued throughout all the rest of his other careers, and the last one I found was about 1956. So that's a pretty long period. So I'm assuming everybody knows what pulps are.
I'm a movie.
Well, see that guy right there behind you? He's the pulp expert. Seriously, I'm not joking. John, don't correct me if I say something
Doing
stupid.
great.
Okay, so pulps, basically about 1880, the Argosy magazine is sort of considered the date when the pulps started. The reason they were called pulps is because they were printed on pulpy paper. So when you open them up, for those of us who collect them now, they just literally start to crumble in your hands. And this is how I got involved with my grandfather's story, because my family could be kind of, anyway, they didn't think that much of my grandfather's pulp writing. In fact, they didn't really know what it was called. They said, oh, he wrote these trashy things. And I kept thinking, what is this? What is this? So finally, I found one of these trashy things, and I just went crazy. I just love them. There are some sleazy ones, Spicy Detective, that kind of thing that Donenfeld was involved with. But my grandfather wrote for what's called the adventure pulps. So adventure, argosy, thrilling stories, thrilling western, short stories, all that kind of thing. And he wrote about what he knew. So when he started out writing in the 20s, he was writing about his military adventures. And I went out to El Paso to Fort Bliss a couple of years ago, and it was so amazing because I was standing in the parking lot, and I looked up, and there was this incredible mountain rising up, and I recognized it immediately from a description from one of his pulps. So that was kind of cool, to recognize that he really did take in the scenery around him and write about it. This is him on horseback. Danny Fingeroth, who, I don't know if you guys know him, but Danny is a wonderful comics historian, Marvel, said he thought that my grandfather was the only comics person to be found on horseback. But that's actually not true. Apparently, was it Martin Goodman?
Martin Goodman, yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, in one of his male magazines he had stuff like that.
There were several.
That's hard to picture.
Illustrators that were in the military.
Yeah, a lot of people are in the military, but specifically horseback.
Yeah, that's right.
here.
Yeah, cavalry, yeah.
Okay. You can go. Sure. So again, this is another pulp. He was in Siberia during World War I, so 1917. This is a photo of him in the Philippines in 1914. And his time in the Philippines was particularly interesting. From the time he started in the Army, he kept asking to command one of the troops of Buffalo soldiers, African-American Buffalo soldiers. And they wouldn't give him the posting because it was considered, like what people who weren't doing so well did. And he was doing really well in the military, so they didn't want to give him the posting. They kept asking for it, asking for it, asking for it. And finally, when he went to the Philippines, he was commanding Troop K of the African-American Buffalo soldiers. And while he was there, he began to realize the prejudice that his troops were put through, and he got more and more annoyed with it. So finally, he challenged his superior officer to a contest, and he said that his men could beat the colonel's men in something called machine gun readiness. Now, what that means is that you gallop up on your horse, you jump off, you throw the machine gun together, and you're ready to go. So that's what it means. And then he was able to train his men so that they did it in 12 seconds. And they broke all the world's records. There was all the high brass was there. And so the colonel kind of didn't like him after that. And so that's one of the reasons he was literally sent to Siberia. Because the people who thought he was doing a really great job thought it'd be a good idea to get him out of the way of this colonel who went to the front. So he went to Siberia, the colonel went to the front. But, you know, there were problems. Okay, so after he was forced out of the military, and that's a long story and I'm not going into it because I had a dream last night with Trina that I talked for 2.5 hours. And you never got a chance to talk. So, okay. This is one of the early comics. My grandfather started a newspaper syndicate in 1925-26. And he was already, you can see he was already thinking of this idea of comics. And so they were original comics, most of them, but some of them were adaptations of The Three Musketeers, and he even drew some of them. So that was his first kind of foray into them.
Where was this? Where was he at that?
He was in New York, in the same building that he was in later with the comics. Okay, so pulps, that was his next big thing. Then when the Depression hit, the pulp writers, he married my grandmother who was Swedish, and they were living in Europe. And when the Depression hit, the pulp writers were not making as much money, so they had to come back to the U.S. And for some reason, he thought that in the middle of the Depression, it'd be a really good idea to start an original comics magazine. Completely unheard of. Most everything with a few one-shots were reprints for newspapers. Do you want to sit? There's no sense standing there. So this is from one of the early comics magazines. So he, in 36, 37, 30, 35, 36, 37, he was putting out a number of comics magazines. People who think that he didn't really do that much really need to recognize how prolific he was during that period. He was editing these things, he was putting out sometimes 3 comics magazines a month. He was overseeing some 20-odd artists and writers. He was overseeing the magazines themselves. He was writing some of the scripts. That's pretty phenomenal. I particularly love this comic, and it's in the book. Is
it by Paddock Munson?
Yes. And I'm going to let you talk. I'm going to let you talk about it.
2 hours?
And Blood Pearls is complete in the book. And it's an unusual pulp story because the hero is an anti-hero. He's a really bad guy. And so that's unusual in itself. And I just love the artwork. It's really stunning. It's quite lush and quite wonderful. And it's Paddock Munson. And I'm going to let Trina tell that story. This is from the cover of the book, and I just wanted you to see that this was originally a pulp. And it was called, he wrote a story called Murder Over London. And the character was called John Nelson. And it was also, he was also called Barry O'Neill. So, okay, so Barry O'Neill and Fang Gao of China is another comic that my grandfather wrote. And that went through the entire 3 years of his, three and some odd months of the whole time that he was in charge of comics. And it's a classic pulp story. The bad guy's this Chinese, evil Chinese guy. And there's just constant action, adventure, heroine, who needs rescuing all the time. Although, I do have to say that one of the things about my grandfather's pulps and his comics is that even though there was always the romantic interest, his women were very strong, and they were usually able to ride, shoot, and could take care of things and often save the guy. So that's kind of unusual for that period, too. And this Bob Merritt and Barry O'Neill were drawn by a guy named Leo O'Malley. Are you guys familiar with him at all? Oh my gosh, he's so fantastic. He's an amazing artist. He started out in newspapers as an illustrator. And one of the things I wanted you to see is look at the innovation here in terms of the panels. So we're not doing these straight newspaper reprint panels anymore. They're starting to experiment in the comics with these different size panels that help to tell the story. And that's one of the things that happened during this period. I think these, I just love Leo O'Malley's work. I mean, to me, some of these could just be paintings by themselves.
Did your grandfather kept these in his house or?
You don't want to know that story.
Oh, no, oh God.
You don't want to know.
Oh, God. How did you find it?
Smoke,
Huh?
smoke,
Oh,
fire.
Oh, God.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on.
Moving on. Oh, God.
This is also Amelia, and again, I just think he is such a brilliant artist. This is one of my favorite covers of all time, because if you look at this, there's not a word on here, but you can tell the entire story. It's just bam, there it is, right there. So I just really love that. That's why I put it there. Okay, this comic was called The Monastery of the Blue God, and it came also from a pulp story of my grandfather's. It's in the book as well. And what a lot of the comics guys and some of the pulp guys didn't know is that this story has a lot of biographical details about my grandfather. And the heroine is called Elsa, which is my grandmother's name. And it's just really quite wonderful. It's basically a love letter to my grandmother. So, and this is also Patagon's. And you can tell how different that from O'Malley and Munson, the different styles. So you don't have that corporate comic book look that you often see that's kind of standardized. These guys were all very, very different in what they were doing. This is my grandfather in 1948 in Sweden. After he lost the comic book company, he wrote nonfiction books during World War II, and then in 1948 he was in Sweden and he found these formulas for industrial paint, and he taught himself chemistry. And my cousin Tony, who was around 5 or 6 at the time, she remembers him being in the kitchen, stirring up these chemical formulas, trying to perfect them, and things blowing up. And he, so he created patents at the end of his life. Yeah, so it was pretty, I just barely touched on everything, but I think the main thing to take away from it is that he was a very creative person, very innovative, and a lot of what we think of about comics today began during this period.